May emerged, it began not with a public statement but with a closed-door meeting King Charles, a discreet legal team, and a stack of historical documents that insiders claim had suddenly become impossible to ignore. Behind palace walls, the mood was said to be icy. A monarch already weakened by illness was now being pulled into a legal storm tied not to the future of the crown, but to its buried past. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Reports suggest the meeting was arranged with unusual urgency, the kind of urgency that does not come from routine paperwork or ceremonial review. This was not, according to palace whispers, a polite conversation about archives. It was a serious legal consultation involving documents that may have sat quietly for years, perhaps even decades, protected by tradition, softened by silence, and understood only by those who knew where the crown kept its most sensitive memories. King Charles, already carrying the weight of illness and a divided family, was reportedly asked to confront a question every monarch fears. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried? The document, TS at the center of the discussion were said to concern more than dates, signatures, and royal procedure. They reportedly touched the deeper machinery of monarchy: ownership, legitimacy, inheritance, and interpretation. In other words, the invisible rules that decide who controls what, who has standing, and who may claim a place within the sacred geography of the British monarchy. To outsiders, such papers may sound dry, but inside the House of Windsor, old documents can be explosive. A line written generations ago can change the meaning of an estate. A forgotten clause can reshape a family argument. A sealed interpretation can become a weapon. That is why insiders claim aides were told to say nothing, no clarification, no warm reassurance, no careful palace phrase designed to drain the story of danger. The silence itself became the signal. When courtiers who normally manage whispers with perfect discipline suddenly refuse to engage, they are said to be in a state of whisper war. It suggests something deeper is moving beneath the polished surface. And this time, the fear was not simply scandal. It was exposure. The kind of exposure that could reopen old wounds inside the House of Windsor at the exact moment King Charles could. Ceased to afford another internal rupture. For Charles, the timing could hardly have been more brutal. Since his health struggles began, every decision around him has carried an added weight. Every meeting is watched. Every absence is measured. Every sign of pressure becomes part of a larger story about the future of the crown. Yet here he was, reportedly drawn into a legal review that forced him to look backward instead of forward, not toward Prince William's reign, not toward national duty, but toward the buried architecture of royal history, where family memory and constitutional responsibility are dangerously intertwined. And that is what made this meeting so chilling. These documents were not merely papers. They were fragments of royal identity, pieces of inheritance, and perhaps even evidence of decisions the monarchy had long preferred to leave untouched. If their meaning changed, then the story the palace had quietly lived with for years could change with it. But what seemed like a routine legal review soon began to look like something far more dangerous, a challenge to the monarchy's own version of history. Some documents are archived because they are old. Others are buried beside monarch because they are dangerous. And according to whispers now circulating through the palace machine, the papers placed before King Charles were not ordinary records. They were the kind of documents that could turn private family memory into public legal consequence and force the crown to confront decisions made long before Charles ever wore it. For generations, the monarchy has survived not only through ceremony, loyalty, and public devotion, but through control of its own story. Every estate, every trust, every title, every sealed instruction has carried a meaning larger than the ink that created it. Balmoral was never just a retreat. Sandringham was never just a private home. The duchy holdings were never merely financial engines. They were pieces of a sacred map, built through inheritance, sacrifice, strategy, and silence. And now, reports suggest that somewhere inside that guarded map, a line had been found that no one wished to explain too loudly. The legal advisors called in by King Charles were reportedly not there to offer comfort. They were there to interpret. That single word is what made the atmosphere so tense. Interpretation is where history becomes dangerous. A document circa ITN sit untouched for decades, treated as settled, respected as tradition, and then suddenly, under new pressure, its meaning can shift. A phrase once considered ceremonial may become legally important. A reference to stewardship may raise questions about ownership. A title assumed to be symbolic may carry hidden consequence. And in the world of the Windsors, where power often hides behind politeness, even one old clause can become a blade. Insiders suggest the review may have touched on historic royal estates, trust arrangements, inheritance structures, or letters patent, the kind of material that lives in the shadowed space between family and crown. Red box papers, old legal notes, archival instructions, and estate interpretations may all have become part of the discussion, not because they were newly created, but because modern scrutiny had made old assumptions harder to protect. What was once handled through deference now had to survive legal examination. What was once whispered between courtiers now risked being dragged toward public curiosity. And that was the nightmare. Not simply that the documents existed, but that they might leak. Palace insiders allegedly feared that if ever document reached the press, the story would no longer be about paperwork. It would become a battle over legitimacy. Who was promised what? Who understood the arrangement? Who benefited from the old interpretation? Who would lose if the wording was read differently now? The palace knows the danger of unanswered questions. In royal life, silence can preserve dignity, but it can also feed suspicion. And once suspicion enters the bloodstream of monarchy, it spreads quickly. For King Charles, this was not an abstract legal exercise. It was a collision between tradition and the age of scrutiny. The crown has always relied on continuity, but continuity depends on people accepting that the past was settled fairly. If these documents suggested otherwise, or even appeared to suggest otherwise, then we would have to agree. The monarchy could be forced into a defensive posture at the very moment it needed calm, unity, and control. That is why the papers became the central artifact of the entire drama. Not because they revealed everything, but because they threatened to. And once those documents were opened, attention quickly turned to the one question every palace aide feared. Who stood to gain if the old interpretati unchanged? For King Charles, this was not merely a legal matter, it was legacy. Every signature, every sealed archive, every yellowing page carried the weight of monarchs before him: Victoria, George VI, Elizabeth II. To tamper with that record was to touch the sacred architecture of the crown itself. And for a king fighting illness, age, and family division, the timing could not have been more brutal. Reports suggest Charles entered this moment carrying more than a sovereign's responsibility. He carried the exhaustion of a man whose reign had begun under the long shadow of loss, expectation, and public judgment. After waiting a lifetime to become king, he inherited not simply a throne, but a mountain of unfinished tensions. The departure of Harry and Meghan had wounded the family's image. Prince Andrew's disgrace had strained public trust. Queen Elizabeth's death had removed the one figure whose silence could calm the institution without explanation. And now, just as Charles was trying to steady the monarchy while facing his own health battle, the past had returned through a stack of documents that refused to remain polite. The presence of Queen Elizabeth II hung over the matter like an unseen command. Even gone, she remained the architect of modern royal order. Her reign had been built on discipline, endurance, and the belief that the crown must survive personal pain. To Charles, any document shaped under her watch would not feel like mere administration. It would feel like a message from the monarch who trained him, tested him, and left him the impossible duty of preserving what she had guarded for 70 years. If the papers touched decisions made during her reign, then reviewing them was not only legal, it was emotional, almost intimate, almost unforgiving. And that was the torment. Charles is not only king, he is a husband, father, brother, and son. He has spent his life navigating affection and obligation, often discovering that the two do not move in the same direction. Family feeling asks for softness. Crown obligation demands steel. A relative may request patience. The institution demands precedent. A private loyalty may whisper, protect them. But the monarchy answers with something colder. Protect the crown first. That is the brutal bargain every sovereign makes, and in this moment Charles was reportedly being asked to honor it while weakened, with my eye etched and surrounded by people who knew the stakes. The documents, according to palace whispers, may have reached into choices made under previous reigns' arrangements about estates, trusts, titles, boundaries, or rights that were once accepted because tradition made them untouchable. But tradition is only powerful when everyone agrees not to question it. Once lawyers begin examining the wording, Once advisors begin asking what was intended and what was merely assumed, the old comfort breaks apart. Suddenly, the question is no longer what the family has always believed. It becomes what the record can prove. That is why this legal issue struck so deeply. The monarchy has always presented itself as a sacred trust held for the nation, not a private possession to be adjusted according to emotion. If Charles allowed personal loyalty to soften the interpretation, he risked weakening the very principle that gives the crown its authority. If he chose cold legal clarity, he risked reopening family wounds that might never fully close. Either path carried pain, either path carried consequence. And so the meeting became a test of kingship itself, not whether Charles could reign in ceremony born, whether he could place duty above blood when the archive demanded it. For a monarch already fighting battles of body, family, and legacy, this was the kind of decision that leaves no one untouched. But inside the palace, not everyone saw the documents as sacred history. Some reportedly saw them as leverage. The danger of old documents is that they do not flatter ambition. They do not bend to charm, reputation, or proximity to power. They simply sit there waiting. And according to insiders, that was precisely why certain palace circles became nervous. If the historical record was reviewed too closely, it might expose not scandal in the modern sense but advantage, assumption, and quiet influence dressed up as tradition. This was where the legal review reportedly stopped being a private matter for King Charles and became a quiet struggle inside the machinery of the palace. Because documents do not only answer questions, they create sides. One interpretation can protect access. Another can limit it. One reading can preserve a circle of influence. Another can shut that circle out with the cold finality of protocol. And in a monarchy built on rank, bloodline, property, and ceremony, EIC's smallest boundary can carry enormous meaning. Reports suggest that different factions began watching the situation with growing unease. Not openly. Never openly. Royal conflict rarely arrives as a shouting match. It moves through delayed briefings, careful silences, unexplained absences, and the sudden tightening of administrative channels. Courtiers who understood the power of the archive allegedly knew that if the review touched estates, trusts, titles, ceremonial rights, or household access, then the consequences could reach far beyond one legal meeting. It could decide who was merely close to power and who was protected by it. Within that tense atmosphere, Queen Camilla's circle was reportedly concerned about what a strict reading of the documents might mean for palace optics. Not accused, not exposed, but concerned, according to whispers, because in royal life perception can become its own kind of power. Camilla had spent years moving from outsider to queen, from scandal to coronation, from public suspicion to official acceptance. Yet acceptance inside the monarchy is never the same as ownership. The crown may welcome, it may elevate, it may forgive, but it does not always transfer its deepest inheritance to those who arrived through marriage rather than blood. That distinction, according to palace observers, may have been what made the review so sensitive. The Parker-Bowles connection hovered at the edge of the conversation not as a legal accusation, but as a question of symbolic boundary. Where does private family life end and royal entitlement begin? Who belongs within ceremonial privilege? Who has access to royal spaces by affection, and who has access by constitutional standing? These are not small questions inside the House of Windsor. They are the kind of questions that define who is embraced, who is tolerated, and who remains permanently outside the sacred line. And that is why the documents became threatening, not because they necessarily named enemies, but because they may have clarified limits. A document that defines property can also define exclusion. A letter patent that explains rank can also expose assumption. A trust arrangement can become a wall. An old instruction can suddenly remind everyone that closeness to the monarch is not the same as closeness to the crown. For some, that kind of clarity would have been reassuring. For Navas, others, it may have felt devastating, because ambiguity is useful to those who benefit from it. It allows influence to grow quietly, without challenge, without signature, without public debate. But once lawyers begin asking what the record actually says, ambiguity starts to die. And when ambiguity dies inside a palace, people who once moved freely can suddenly find the corridors narrowing around them. And when boundaries inside the monarchy are threatened, the old guard does not shout, it moves. Princess Anne did not need a throne to understand power. She understood files, signatures, protocol, silence. And when reports of Charles's legal consultation began rippling through the highest echelons of the firm, insiders claim Anne's concern was immediate, not because she feared history, but because she feared what ambitious hands might try to do with it. For decades, Anne had been seen as the iron-willed guardian of the old royal discipline, the one who understood that monarchy survives not through softness, but through structure. She had watched the crown endure scandal, grief, rebellion, and public doubt, and through it all, she had learned one hard lesson. When boundaries blur, the institution bleeds. So if the historical documents now under review could affect access, property, titles, or symbolic legitimacy, then Anne reportedly believed the matter could not be handled through private comfort or family compromise. It had to be handled through law, through archive, through the unforgiving language of precedent. Those familiar with palace procedure suggest Anne's instinct was not dramatic, but surgical. No emotional pleading, no public briefing, no reckless accusation. Instead, she allegedly pushed for strict legal clarity, controlled access to archival material, and a disciplined review of every relevant interpretation before anyone inside the wider family circle could shape the narrative. To Anne, the danger was not only what the documents might say. The danger was what people might claim they meant before the crown had spoken through its proper channels. And this is where Prince William's shadow reportedly entered the story. As heir, William could not treat the issue as a private inconvenience. Anything left unresolved under Charles could become a burden under his reign. Every uncertainty, every informal privilege, every cloudy interpretation could one day land on his desk as a crisis. Reports suggest William understood what Anne understood. The future crown had to be protected from inherited ambiguity. If the monarchy was to survive the next generation, it could not allow old assumptions to harden into claims. Prince Edward II was said to represent a quieter but no less important force. Known by some royal watchers as the guardian of the fine print, Edward's strength has never been spectacle. It has been patience, loyalty, and attention to the details others ignore. In a conflict built around documents, that kind of discipline mattered. Where Anne brought steel and William brought future authority, Edward reportedly brought the calm precision of a man who understood that one phrase in an old royal paper can carry more power than 100 public statements. Together, their reported position formed what insiders began calling the Windsor Archive Protocol. It was not a public decree. It was colder than that. It was an internal doctrine, a hardening of procedure, a quiet command that no informal assumption would be treated as valid until legal interpretation was complete. Access would be narrowed, claims would be frozen, palace chat, there would be contained. The archive would not be used as a weapon by whoever reached it first. For those who believed closeness to Charles could soften the process, the message was devastating. Affection might open doors in private life, but it would not rewrite the crown's records. The monarchy, under pressure, was returning to its oldest survival instinct. Control the documents, control the interpretation, control the future. What followed was not a family argument. It was bureaucratic warfare, fought with archive access, legal memos, and the quiet brutality of protocol. The Windsor Archive Protocol was not announced. It did not need to be. Palace power rarely arrives with a trumpet. It arrives as a memo, a restricted file, a revoked clearance, a delayed invitation. And according to those familiar with royal administrative streams, the new instruction was devastatingly simple. Until the documents were fully reviewed, no one outside the proper constitutional chain would touch them. That was the moment the atmosphere reportedly changed. What had begun as a sensitive legal consultation around King Charles became something colder, tighter, and far more controlled. The palace, insider, suggest, shifted from concern to containment. Access to the historical papers was allegedly narrowed to those with a direct legal, constitutional, or archival role. Casual curiosity was no longer tolerated. Soft influence was no longer enough. Anyone hoping to shape the meaning of the documents through private conversation, personal closeness, or quiet pressure suddenly found the doors closing. Legal teams were said to be reviewing everything with unforgiving precision. Estate records, inheritance notes, trust language, letters patent, archival correspondence, and any earlier interpretation that might have guided royal practice. Every phrase mattered. Every date mattered. Every signature carried weight. Because in a monarchy, the past is not dead paperwork. It is a living structure. It decides rank. It protects property. It defines belonging. And once that structure is questioned, the palace must either defend it completely or risk watching it fracture under public pressure. Reports suggest courtiers were warned against leaking, briefing, or even speculating beyond approved channels. That warning alone revealed the stakes. Leaks are dangerous in any institution, but inside the CR, they can become weapons of survival. A single whispered interpretation can create a headline. A headline can create pressure. Pressure can force a palace statement. And once the palace is forced to explain what it wanted to keep sealed, the mystery becomes bigger than the document itself. That was precisely what the Windsor Archive Protocol appeared designed to prevent. Not truth, but chaos. Prince William and Princess Anne reportedly emerged as the protectors of continuity during this tense phase. For William, the issue was about the reign he would one day inherit. He could not allow vague privileges or disputed assumptions to drift forward like hidden explosives beneath his future throne. For Anne, the concern was even more direct. She had spent her life watching duty get tested by vanity, emotion, and entitlement. If the records had to be read, then they had to be read properly. Not emotionally, not politically, properly. And then there was Charles, caught in the center of it all. A king who may have wanted peace was reportedly forced to accept clarity. A man who may have preferred family calm was pulled toward institutional discipline. That is the cruelty of monarchy. Manasseh ives a person a crown, then slowly strips away the luxury of choosing only as a person. Charles could soothe feelings, or he could protect the record. He could preserve comfort, or he could preserve authority. But he could not do both forever. The protocol froze the room. It turned old assumptions into questions and private influence into a liability. And as the review deepened, the silence around the documents grew heavier, not lighter. Yet the more the palace tried to contain the issue, the more one fear grew. What if the documents revealed a truth the monarchy had avoided for decades? This was the cruelest position for any monarch. To sit between the people he loved and the institution he had sworn to protect. King Charles, insiders suggest, entered the room as a husband, a father, and a wounded man. But the documents demanded something colder from him. They demanded that he become sovereign first, and that everyone else, no matter how close, stand outside the red line. That red line was not drawn in anger. It was drawn by history. Charles may have wished, as any man would, to keep peace around him while his health remained a subject of national concern and private strain. He wanted the warmth of loyalty, the quiet of family unity, the comfort of knowing that after years of public fractures, the palace could still hold itself together. But monarchy does not always reward tenderness. Sometimes it punishes it. Sometimes the very desire to protect people becomes the weakness that threatens the institution itself. Reports suggest his legal advisors made the danger painfully clear. If the documents were handled loosely, if old assumptions were allowed to stand without proper review, if informal influence was permitted to shape interpretation, the consequences would not stop with Charles. They could pass directly into William's reign like an unpaid debt. A question left unanswered today could become a constitutional bruise tomorrow. A private understanding left vague could become a public challenge later. And for a future king already expected to modernize the monarchy while defending its oldest foundations, ambiguity was not mercy. It was risk. That warning reportedly struck at the deepest part of Charles's burden. He had spent his life waiting for the crown, only to receive it at a moment of grief, illness, and division. Now, instead of enjoying the authority he had inherited, he was being asked to limit the very personal loyalties that made him human. Every royal family has arguments. Every powerful house has rivalries. But inside the Windsors, disagreement becomes dangerous when it touches succession, property, titles, or legitimacy. Those are not family matters. They are pillars. Princess Anne and Prince William, according to palace whispers, pushed for finality. Not cruelty. Finality. Anne understood that a monarchy cannot survive on emotional exceptions. William understood that his future depended on clean lines, not inherited fog. Together, they reportedly pressed for the review to continue under strict control, no matter whose comfort it disturbed. Their position was stern, but simple. The crown must not enter the next reign carrying questions that could have been answered now. For Charles, that meant surrendering the illusion that peace could be preserved by avoiding pain. The documents had already changed the mood inside the palace. They had turned memory into evidence, affection into pressure, and silence into suspicion. To halt the review would have looked like fear. To soften it would have invited doubt. To proceed, and accepting that some people close to him might feel wounded by the outcome. But to refuse would have wounded something larger. So, insiders suggest Charles allowed the process to move forward, reluctantly, carefully, under strict legal control. It was not the decision of a man chasing confrontation. It was the decision of a king cornered by duty, forced to choose the cold protection of the institution over the fragile comfort of personal ease. And with that decision, the palace entered a new order, one where history would no longer be softened for comfort. By dawn, nothing had officially changed. No proclamation had been issued. No palace statement had explained the legal meeting. But inside the machinery of monarchy, everything had shifted. The documents had spoken, or at least they had been allowed to speak again. And for those who believed old paper could be ignored, the message was brutal. The crown forgets nothing. That was the quiet force of the moment. Not spectacle, not scandal in its loudest form, but something colder and more permanent, a turning of the lock inside the institution. Reports suggest the legal meeting marked a turning point in how the palace would handle most sensitive inheritance questions going forward. No more soft assumptions, no more blurred access, no more private comfort standing in the place of formal authority. The archive had been pulled back to the center, and with it came the old royal truth that procedure can be more powerful than any public speech. For King Charles, the decision may have been painful, but it also revealed the shape of his reign under pressure. He had been forced to choose between emotional ease and institutional clarity, and according to palace whispers, the crown chose clarity. That choice did not require cruelty, it required discipline. The monarchy, at its most enduring, does not survive because every family wound is healed. It survives because duty keeps moving even when the family is wounded. That is the part outsiders often miss. Behind the gold, the titles, and the ceremony, there is a harsher bargain. Personal feeling must bend when the national trust is at stake. The old guard understood this instinctively. Princess Anne, Prince William, and those aligned with strict royal continuity reportedly did not need to win a public argument. They only needed the system to remember itself, and I did, through silence, through legal review, through tightened access, through the calm, devastating power of procedure. In the palace, control is not always announced. Sometimes it is felt in what is no longer permitted, in who is no longer consulted, in which files no longer travel beyond the proper hands. The documents themselves remained sealed, but their symbolic force dominated everything. That was what made them so dangerous. They did not need to be published to reshape behavior. Their existence alone reminded everyone inside the House of Windsor that history still had authority. Old signatures still mattered. Boundaries still mattered. The crown was not a private inheritance to be softened around personal preference. It was a sacred trust held on behalf of the nation, and every person near it, however beloved or powerful, stood beneath that principle. For William, the consequences may prove even greater. A future reign cannot be built on unanswered questions. It cannot begin with shadows left behind by the previous generation. By allowing the review to continue under strict control, Charles may have done something painful but necessary. He may have cleared the ground for my son, not with drama, not with triumph, but with the heavy, silent work of making ambiguity answerable to law. And as the palace doors closed once more, the lesson was unmistakable. Blood may inherit a name, but only duty inherits the crown. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.